I am Alexa. There is no other. I am Alexa. Alexa is my name.
Hello there, I'm Lloyd Evans and you're watching the John Cedars channel from the bunker, and in this video we're going to be taking another look at the 2019 annual meeting of Jehovah's Witnesses. This video is part 2. If you haven't already seen part 1, stop the video now, go back and watch part 1 just so you know where you're up to in this crazy merry-go-round of cult propaganda. Assuming you have watched part 1, and don't let me down there, we're now going to launch straight back into the talks. Next up on the podium is governing body member David Splain, and just so you have a little bit of context so that you can appreciate David Splain's humour, David Splain is getting up on the stage immediately after Alexa has been unveiled as being fully cult conversant.
Alexa, play original songs from jw.org.
Playing original songs.
Again, I mention all this in part 1. So David Splain is getting up on the stage immediately after Jehovah's Witnesses have been told that Alexa will now play them various cult propaganda the Watchtower churns out.
Alexa, where are you when I need you? Well, an attack coming from the north. What are we talking about? Are we talking about the attack of Gog of Magog? No. We're talking about an attack by a plague of locusts coming from the north.
Now, is it me, or did that just not really work? If you're gonna do stand-up, I would suggest that you need to keep the humour rolling. And what David Splain does there is he kind of launches into a joke, doesn't really have a follow-up planned, and then immediately has to, having started with such levity and having brought the audience to hysterics, he then has to launch into a deeply profound talk on Bible prophecy and locusts coming from the north. This kind of demonstrates in a way the problem that the governing body has at these events. They all, to varying degrees, seem to want to, I don't know, get a few laughs from the audience. But at the same time, they are spiritual leaders, irrespective of what Gerrit Loesch was saying in part 1. They are spiritual leaders, and to a degree, they kind of need to act like spiritual leaders. So even when they're cracking jokes, they've got to immediately steer the conversation back onto more serious ground, as we saw David Splain do there. And for me, it just doesn't quite work. It looks and sounds awkward. But anyway, back to the talk itself. David Splain wants to regale us with his wisdom, or the governing body's wisdom, about a plague of locusts coming from the north. And he's going to explain why Watchtower has seen fit to introduce new light on what various Bible verses describing locusts are referring to.
Now, I think you can see that we're not talking about insects here. Notice in verse 8, each man advances in his course. So we're talking about people who are likened to locusts, who have the characteristics of locusts. And the question is, are these good people or are they bad people? Well, for many years, including in the April 15th, 2009 Watchtower, our understanding was that these were good people. In fact, these were Jehovah's people. These were Jehovah's Witnesses who were preaching the good news of the kingdom. And the idea was that they were just like locusts, because first of all, you couldn't stop them from preaching, and they would go to any length to keep preaching the good news, probably not going to people's windows like thieves, but otherwise they'd stop short of that, but they would do other things. Preaching the good news, it didn't matter what wall of opposition was erected against them, they would scale that wall and keep preaching. And if we were to confine ourselves to a reading of just these 3 verses, we could make a case for that explanation. But now, prophecy is best understood when we consider it in context. And if you look at the context of Joel chapter 2, you are forced to come to a different conclusion. Verse 20, I will drive the northerner far away from you. I will disperse him to a dry and desolate wasteland with his vanguard toward the eastern sea. Well, Jehovah is talking about the locusts here, and he says he's going to drive them away. If these were kingdom publishers who are declaring the good news, why would Jehovah want to drive them away? And then, how does Jehovah view these locusts? Look at the last part of verse 20. The foul smell from him will ascend, the stench from him will keep ascending. That's not good. So it's looking like these locusts are not good people. What is Jehovah talking about here? Pest control. He doesn't like the locusts.
This, for me, is a fascinating talk because it shows how human the governing body is when it comes to figuring out what Bible verses mean, particularly regarding prophecy. David Splain is obviously talking here about locusts that are mentioned in the Bible. And if you go to books like the Revelation Climax book, it refers to the mention of locusts in Joel and the mention of locusts in Revelation as both referring to God's people and therefore both being positive references to locusts. But what we're hearing here is that yet another prediction or yet another understanding from this book that was released in the late 80s has now been deemed wrong. It's been replaced by new light. And the new light has come about, apparently, because only in the year 2019, when this talk was given, only in the year 2019 was the faithful slave able to read a Bible verse in context. That's essentially what he's saying. He's saying, well, obviously, if you base your understanding of the locusts in Joel on just these 3 verses, then you could make a case for what we've been teaching for decades, that these locusts are actually God's people and are therefore good. They're the good guys. But, actually, it really helps if you read these verses in context.
Prophecy is best understood when we consider it in context.
And actually, the whole idea is contradicted when you read verse 20. Hold on a minute, David. What's your excuse as to why you weren't able to figure this out years ago? If the faithful slave was truly appointed in 1919, why has it taken them 100 years to reach the right understanding of what this verse means, when apparently this correct understanding was staring them in the face all along just by reading on a few verses? How on earth are we supposed to take the faithful slave seriously when they are this bad at figuring out what Bible prophecies mean?
The locusts are bad people. If they are not Jehovah's faithful servants, we have to look for a different explanation. What could it be? It's a simple one. Joel is predicting a military attack. Jehovah will use Babylonian soldiers who are just like locusts, my great army, he calls them, to bring his people into captivity. And the army is called the northerner because the Babylonians will come up and invade Israel from the north. And after that, so the Babylonians have done what they were going to do. I will pour out my spirit on every sort of flesh, and your sons and your daughters will prophesy. Your old men will dream dreams, and your young men will see visions. And even on my male slaves and female slaves, I will pour out my spirit in these days. Well, when was the prophecy fulfilled? After that, certainly. The Apostle Peter tells us that it was first fulfilled at Pentecost 33 CE. Jehovah poured out his Spirit, and at the end of that day, there were 3,000 publishers of the kingdom. Well, now can we see a little bit of a parallel here? 1919. In 1919, according to official records, there were fewer than 6,000 publishers of the good news. But has Jehovah blessed the efforts of those 6,000 publishers? By the end of the century, he certainly had shown that he'd blessed the efforts of the brothers. Do you know that every year since 1983, more than 144,000 have been baptized each year? And our brothers today don't have the gifts of the Spirit. So what does this indicate? It indicates that Jehovah has made a mighty outpouring of his Spirit in these last days. It's a marvelous thing to behold.
No, David, it indicates that you and your colleagues have been prolific over the decades in lying to, exploiting, and misleading people. That's all you can really conclude from the figures that you have just shown. It doesn't make you God's one and only true organization. It certainly doesn't mean that Jehovah's Witnesses have fulfilled these obscure predictions in the book of Joel, which you yourself, by the way, have only just said were actually fulfilled in Pentecost 33 CE. But here's where we get the supreme irony. We've only just heard David Splain effectively give undeniable evidence that the faithful slave are not guided by God's Spirit, and they do just make things up as they go along. And yet they are still asking witnesses to buy into this idea of 1919 as being significant, to the point where they're even twisting the whole verse round to say, yes, well, it was fulfilled in Pentecost 33 CE, but we're all pattern seekers, aren't we? We can see a pattern here. And the pattern we want you to see is that this could also refer, or be described as referring, to 1919, when God's people were released from Babylonish bondage, from being ensnared by false religion. And it just so happens that in the same year, God chose the faithful and discreet slave, which now, of course, includes David Splain. It's all ultimately one huge back-patting exercise.
Well, today, thousands upon thousands are getting baptized, and we can expect that more are going to get baptized in the future with the new instructions we've received. Concentrate more on conversations, concentrate more on starting Bible studies. With those instructions in mind, no doubt we're going to have a tremendous increase in baptisms.
I'm going to hold you to that, David. I would not be quite so optimistic. By the way, he earlier said, this is something else that I didn't quite mention. He mentioned something about in excess of 144,000 baptisms per year for the last few years.
Every year since 1983, more than 144,000 have been baptized each year.
What's that got to do with anything? Why pick an arbitrary number from Jehovah's Witness theology and say, this arbitrary number I've picked, we've exceeded it, yay! Where's our trophy? Honestly, to suggest that we're now going to have an increase in baptisms year on year just because David Splain's feeling upbeat about the whole thing.
No doubt we're going to have a tremendous increase in baptisms.
Clearly, Watchtower was very proud about the fact that they had in excess of 300,000 baptisms for 2019, but I would suggest that they need to prepare for fewer in the future as it gets more and more obvious exactly what kind of organisation this is. We'll see whether David Splain's prediction pans out, but I wouldn't be so positive in his shoes.
Well, we might think of this illustration or this explanation and say, well, that's obvious. This explanation is obvious. Why didn't we see it before? And the answer is yes, it's obvious when Jehovah's time for us to understand it comes along. But before Jehovah's time for us to understand it comes along, it isn't always so obvious. So we always look to Jehovah God for clarification in matters.
What we've just heard is, in a nutshell, the New Light teaching. David Splain's given us a perfect example of a wrong idea that Jehovah's people have been holding on to for decades, where if they just read a few verses along, they would have realised that they were barking up the wrong tree. And we've suddenly decided, as the faithful slave, to start reading prophetic verses in context. And here's one we got wrong. All this says, David, is that you're just another human organisation pretending to know it all, pretending to have a hotline to God. And rather than humbly confess your mistake, what you're effectively doing here is blaming it all on God. You're saying, it just wasn't the right time. It's obvious now because it's the right time for us to understand. But just a month ago, or just 6 months ago, or just a year ago, it wasn't the right time yet, even though it would have been just as obvious if I'd presented the same information at the 2018 annual meeting, or the 2017 annual meeting, or the 2016 annual meeting, even though it's blindingly obvious that this is wrong no matter when in history we're dealing with it. We're going to pretend that this is all part of God's plan. God didn't want us to know until right now. God didn't want his faithful slave to understand what this verse meant until 100 years after choosing his faithful slave. It's God's fault. One of my very first videos ever, well, not one of my first videos ever, one of my very first vlog videos dealing with the whole issue of New Light. I put it this way, I called it my makeweight scenario. And the way I explain this is by what I call the makeweight scenario. Okay, so the makeweight scenario goes something like this. To support the increasing light doctrine, you need to, if you're a Jehovah's Witness, find me a single scripture in the Bible that gives the impression that a God who cannot lie, a God of truth, would knowingly and deliberately give false information to his servants as a makeweight until true knowledge is revealed at a later stage. That is essentially what the increasing light doctrine is. There are no Bible verses that describe this makeweight philosophy on God's part. There are Bible verses that point to God's people being ignorant and not knowing what they're supposed to do, and now it's the right time for me to tell you what to do. But there are no Bible verses at all that describe God lying to his people and asking them to uphold this lie and teach this lie and preach this lie until he finally gets round to replacing it with truth. There is no such verse. That's why the whole teaching of New Light is utter nonsense, doesn't make sense. Or more specifically, it does make sense if you want to accuse God of being a liar. And that, of course, would contradict Bible verses that say that God cannot lie, that God is all about truth and wisdom. So what David Splain is doing here is letting himself off the hook and excusing his colleagues and indeed his forebears going all the way back to 1919, but he's doing that entirely at God's expense.
Who is the most important person that you know? Well, as dedicated witnesses of Jehovah, I'm sure you would say Jehovah. Well, who is the second most important person that you know? I asked my wife that once, and she said, you. And then she said, I'm just joking. No, it's Jesus Christ, and we all know that. But now, how important is it for us to know not just Jehovah, but also his Son? Now, if I should ask you, how many of you know me? Raise your hands, please. Get them down, because you don't really know me. Oh, in a sense, you were right in raising your hand. You know who I am. You know the position I have. You've got my name. You heard me give some talks and so forth. So you have some knowledge of me, but there's so many things about me that you don't know. And if you did know these things, it wouldn't help you. But now coming to know Jehovah is altogether different. Coming to know Jesus is altogether different. The more we know about them, why then the better we have of a relationship with them. And we're going to benefit from that knowledge in ever so many ways.
This whole talk is to introduce a new publication. So Jehovah's Witnesses at the 2019 annual meeting were treated to the release of a new study version of the Bible just for the books from Matthew through to Acts. So the 4 Gospels and the book of Acts in a nice new printed version with wide margins for taking notes, with lots of, footnotes, and lots of illustrations and maps and that sort of thing. That's what this whole talk is about. But I just find it fascinating that Sam Hurd cannot give a talk like this, where really and truthfully, he's supposed to be praising God or praising Jesus without making it all about himself and using the audience's perception of him and his position to anchor his comments or to use that as a basis for what he's saying about God and the Bible. For me, it just smacks heavily of ego.
We think of Jehovah and his great wisdom and the blessings that he has showered upon us as a result of the creation around us. And how many of us enjoy going to the beautiful parks at a certain time of year and enjoying all the creation, the greenery, the flowers, the trees. There's just no end to it. And whenever we see the fish that we've never seen before, and there's so many fish that are so new to us, their beauty, it all speaks of Jehovah as the creator, does it not? And we marvel at these wonderful things.
Jehovah is real because of fish. Fish and their beauty. I'm pretty sure you can take a walk through a park or go to an aquarium. What is it with Watchtower and aquariums, by the way? Or fish. I'm sure you can take a walk through a beautiful park or admire fish and not have to be a Jehovah's Witness. I'm pretty sure you can appreciate nature and come to an albeit indefensible conclusion that it couldn't exist without God's input, without identifying as one of Jehovah's Witnesses. He just can't help but imply that only Jehovah's Witnesses can lay claim to a divine cause for the natural beauty around them.
We're able to have the knowledge of his purpose. We know that he's not responsible for all the wickedness that goes on in the earth around us. That's not of his making, but yet people in the world feel that it is. If someone dies, they blame God. Why did he take that beautiful little girl? She's only 2 years old. Why did he do a thing like that? Well, they have no knowledge. But you have knowledge. When a person dies that they love people in the world, they have no idea about the resurrection. They feel that two things can happen. Many of them feel this way, not all, but two things can happen. Either they go to heaven and become a flower in his garden up there in some kind of a way, or else they go somewhere else where they are tormented day and night forever and ever.
There's just so much smugness and condescension here, which again is really indicative of the entire mindset of the governing body. You know, when people in the world ask questions, ask genuine questions as to why suffering exists, and when people in the world say, oh, why did God kill this child? They're not literally saying that God killed a child. They are arguing, how could an all-powerful God allow this child to die? If you are all-powerful and you have the power to stop a child from dying, then you are in a way responsible for that child dying. You've had the power to stop it and you haven't stopped it. It would be the same as watching a toddler wander out into the road on a busy road, and you're just walking down the street and you see this happening, and it's in your power to just quickly grab that toddler and get them out of harm's way. And instead you stand by the road and wait for a truck to come along and plough into this toddler. That would surely be evil. And so when people are saying God allowed this child to die or God killed this child, they're making a legitimate point. And you don't answer that point by sneering at them, by belittling them, by patronizing them in the way Sam Hurd is doing here.
He was neither rich nor powerful from the world's point of view. He did not even have a home that he could call his own, yet his teachings have changed the course of history. They have helped millions to gain something more important than material wealth. The man, Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Jehovah wants us to know his Son, to love his Son, to be like his Son. To help us know his Son, Jehovah lovingly reserved a portion of his word, the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the book of Acts. These Bible books have helped true Christians to find the happiest, most meaningful life possible.
So we're now being treated to what can only be described as a rather cheesy, cringeworthy, Apple-style launch of this new study Bible. They can't simply just lift it in front of the audience as they would traditionally do at conventions and say, we're delighted to announce a new publication. No. We're in the age of JW broadcasting. we've got to do something fancy. And for me, it was a bit overkill with the graphics. So they've gone to extraordinary lengths here to have witnesses posing in all sorts of historical situations. And I'm not really sure what the connection is with the Gospels. They're basically posing as witnesses from the early and mid 20th century. The message seems to be the Bible has helped witnesses in the past, and it can help witnesses today with the aid of this new study Bible. But it just feels like overkill. We don't need witnesses to be dressing up in period costumes, and we don't need these fancy mock-ups of historical scenarios, and we certainly don't need floating titles of bits of the Bible floating over fields and goodness knows what. Rather than using floating titles for the way they're intended to actually announce the title of a video, they are putting them all the way through to show the word joyful, or show the word love, or show the word long suffering. It's just overkill, it's cheesy, it's unnecessary, and it's irritating.
The Gospels portray a man of tender and deep feelings. They show the wide range of Jesus' personality: compassion for a leper, indignation at self-righteous religious leaders.
Alexa, list some examples of self-righteous religious leaders.
Anthony Mars III, Geoffrey Jackson, David Splain, Samuel Hurd, Kenneth Cook, Mark Sanderson, Stephen Lett.
Matthew, an apostle, evidently wrote his gospel for the Jews. Over 40% of its content is unique. Mark's vigorous, fast-moving account was seemingly written for non-Jewish readers. It mentions 19 miracles of Jesus, including the only account of the deaf man whose hearing Jesus restored. Luke, the beloved physician, wrote for both Jews and non-Jews. Some 60% of this gospel is unique, including the account of the resurrection of the only child of the widow of Nain. John, the apostle who was especially close to Jesus, wrote his gospel last. Some 90% contains information not found in the other three gospels. Only John mentions the resurrection of Lazarus. In this touching account, Jesus openly sheds tears. How comforting it is to know that Jesus has such deep empathy. Together, the four Gospels paint a detailed portrait of Jesus.
This, unfortunately, is what happens when uneducated people who have no formal training, no formal Bible scholarship at all, are left in charge of understanding the Bible and its origins. What we've just heard is a purely fundamentalist, literalist interpretation of what the Gospels are and who wrote them. Matthew apparently wrote Matthew. Mark apparently wrote Mark. Luke apparently wrote Luke. And John obviously wrote John. I understand that if you're watching this as a Christian, you're not necessarily going to like to hear this. But Bible scholars do not take such a simplistic approach to understanding the Gospels. It turns out that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are assigned names. The books themselves don't claim to be written by those men. The writer of Matthew doesn't say, by the way, I'm Matthew, hi there. Same for the other Gospels. Someone literally came along and said, I've decided that this was written by a guy called Matthew. We're going to call it Matthew so that we can distinguish between the different Gospels. To suggest that Matthew literally wrote Matthew when it doesn't even say that in the book itself is incredibly uninformed and indicative of how little these men understand the Bible. I mean, we had a good example in David Splain's talk of how little they even researched the Bible to come up with their teachings. Apparently, checking the context of prophecy is an afterthought. We're getting a similar insight into how little the governing body really understands the Bible and its origins in this part of the video. And I also just wanted to flag something about John. You'll have noticed there Sam Hurd saying that 90% of the book of John isn't to be found in any of the other Gospels. By the way, he's referring to the fact that the Gospels obviously overlap with each other in describing the same events, but they don't always complement each other in doing so. So there are contradictions in the way these events are recounted. But he says 90% of John isn't to be found in the other Gospels. For example, only in John do we find out that Jesus resurrected Lazarus.
Only John mentions the resurrection of Lazarus.
You would think that if that really happened, that would be among the top 5 things for the writers of Matthew, Mark and Luke to at least devote a sentence to. Right, your job, Mark, is to write an account of the most interesting and compelling events of the life of Jesus. Are you up to it? Absolutely. So what are you going to write about? Are you going to include the part where he literally brings someone back from the dead and the tomb opens and this guy walks out in his bandages, even though he's been dead for 3 days? Are you going to include that? I was going with a different angle. I've got some other events in mind that are a bit more significant than that, but I'll take your suggestion on board.
How can we benefit fully from the 4 Gospels and the book of Acts? We must do more than just read them. We must slow down and take the time to study them carefully and meditate on them deeply. We need to bring the accounts to life by doing research, observing details, comparing parallel accounts, and using our imagination to see, hear, and feel the action. Over the years, our organization has published a number of books designed to help us to dig deep. At the annual meeting in 2015, the governing body announced that a new online study Bible would be released. No question about it, our organization has given us the help we need to dig deeper into the Gospels and the book of Acts and to reflect appreciatively on them. As a result, we come to know the Son of God better and better. We agree with the sentiment of the Apostle Peter, who said of Jesus, "Though you never saw him, you love him."
Am I the only one who is just astonished at the celebrity treatment that Sam Hurd is giving himself in this video? It's not enough for him to just announce a new publication. No, we're now in 2019. Well, we're in 2020, but this was in 2019. It's 2019. Why not push the boat out? Why not have a fancy photo shoot of meek, humble and modest Brother Hurd in a number of different situations? Honestly, it's just not the way I was raised to think of the governing body. When did it become the norm for these men to more or less encourage witnesses to idolize them? I'm sorry, that's what we're seeing here. We're seeing Sam Hurd being idolized, and apparently He's completely okay with it. Also, you'll have noticed that still, I say it's a still, it's a fancy photograph of Sam Hurd. We've walked in on him doing his study and he's there sat in what I've been led to believe is called a womb chair. Apparently these things are very expensive. But hey, we're talking about the faithful and discreet slave here, guys. I mean, come on, if we're gonna spend Caleb and Sophia's ice cream money on anything, I'm sure we can at least fork out $3,500 for a fancy chair for Brother Hurd to rest his arse in.
Have you benefited from using the online study Bible? I'm sure you will agree that it is a great tool to help us come to know God's Son better and better. But what if accessing the information online is not easy for you as an individual? Well, let's face it, not everyone has easy access to the internet or finds it easy to navigate online. Well, the governing body is pleased to announce the release of a printed version of the Study Bible containing the 5 Bible books we just discussed in the video, Matthew through Acts. Why are we releasing a printed version of the Study Bible? Well, many prefer a printed medium such as a book, especially for doing deeper reading and making notes. It's easier to slow down and absorb the information at hand. And many of us find it easier when we use a printed and bound book for our study periods. Have you ever gone back and found something you read in a book because you recall that it was either at the top or the bottom of a page, or on the left or on the right-hand side of a 2-page spread?
I don't think this particular part of the annual meeting is going to age all that well. Well, clearly none of it's going to age well. But when we're talking about the need for printed publications, you look at what's been happening with the organisation and the way they've increasingly been steering away from printing, particularly with the magazines. I mean, they've reduced the magazines so much now. It used to be that you could fit, well, hang on, let me show you. These are Watchtower and Awake bound volumes for 1986. And this is the most recent combined bound volume that I have. This is the one for 2017. So that's how much they've reduced printing for the magazines. It's clearly the direction they're going in to say, look, things don't need to be printed. People can read them online. People can sustain their spirituality without us throwing a whole bunch of printed stuff at them. And that makes sense from a financial side of things more than anything. But what Sam Hurd is saying here is that there will always be a place for printed publications. And interestingly, Samuel Hurd is by no means alone as a governing body member at this annual meeting in going on record saying that there is a place for printed publications in worship.
But now here's a little word of caution. By all means, have conversations. By all means, read the Bible to people. By all means, offer Bible studies. But don't forget to offer literature. If you say, I deliberately didn't offer one piece of literature all month, you're not bragging. What do we print it for? And brothers, let's be realistic about it. You have a lovely conversation with someone, and then you don't find the person for another 3 weeks. Leave the person some literature that he can read so he can further his interest.
So it seems that David Splain too, based on what he'd said earlier in his talk, which I've only shared now, David Splain too has a fondness for printed publications, as indeed I do, I must be honest. What will happen when this fondness for printed literature that's clearly still there in the governing body comes up against the reality of the organisation having to downsize and having to cut costs? Because I would submit that it's almost inevitable that at some point the organisation has to stop printing to anything like the scale it's printing today.
Would you like to see what this new publication looks like? Well, let's watch the next video. What are some of the features of the printed study Bible that make it an effective tool for studying the four Gospels and the book of Acts? Let's see. This study Bible is designed to help you study more deeply and bring Bible accounts to life. Take, for instance, the account of the widow in the temple.
Verse 41 says that Jesus sat down with the treasury chests in view. What does the study note say about treasury chests? That's interesting. According to rabbinical sources, there were 13 treasury chests for collecting the contributions of those entering the temple. And these chests were apparently located in the area called the Court of the Women. I wonder where that was in the temple. The study note directs us to Appendix B11. Wow, look at those 4 giant golden lampstands. The facades surrounding the front doors may have been plated with gold. Impressive. The light from the rising sun would have been reflected with dazzling brilliance. Let me go back to the account. Verse 42 says, "Now a poor widow came and dropped in 2 small coins of very little value." What does the parallel account say? Luke's account calls her a needy widow. The study note says, "Needy" may denote a person who lacks the basic necessities of life, or someone for whom life is a great struggle. Might the widow have felt that her small gift was too insignificant to matter?
First of all, more overuse of floating titles. Come on, guys, is it really necessary? We get the point by this stage that you're flogging a new Bible. You don't have to show us the words Matthew, Mark, Luke and Acts floating all over the place and the Bible text floating goodness knows where. Second of all, this is apparently the way witnesses are to use this new study Bible. They're supposed to, I can't think of a better way of putting it, I'm afraid. They're supposed to mentally masturbate over these innocuous Bible verses, so that when they're reading about the needy widow, they're supposed to find out how many collection boxes there were in the temple and, the gold on the temple would have reflected the sun's light with dazzling brilliance. And they're supposed to go into it with all this detail, none of which makes it true. It's still an account that cannot be verified historically by archaeologists. You're just taking it on face value that these things really happened. And quite frankly, if you were to put your hand up at the Kingdom Hall meeting, if there's a question dealing with the needy widow, and if you were to include all of these, when I searched in Appendix 11b, I cross-referenced with the account in Luke, Everyone in the audience is just going to be thinking, you total knob. Nobody likes a smart aleck, and nobody likes witnesses in a congregation who are impressing everyone with how much research they've done. So it's all very well encouraging witnesses to do this level of study, but I can't see an obvious utility or application for them to go into the verses in this much detail. I would quite frankly prefer people who want to study the Bible to study what scholars have to say about the Bible, to study the findings and conclusions of incredibly intelligent people who have devoted their entire careers to learning more about where the Bible comes from, who wrote it, and what their agenda was. I am still only scratching the surface in my own studies in that direction, but I can safely say that I have learned more about the Bible from Bible scholars than I ever learned in my decades as a witness.
Clearly, the Study Bible is designed to help us study the Bible more deeply. May this printed edition of Matthew through Acts help you to come to know Jesus Christ, the Son of God, better and better.
Thank you very much, Brother Hurd. I appreciate what we heard from you. And what a blessing the Study Bible has proven to be for those who have it available in their language.
Now, having said all that about the Study Bible, I must now be a complete and utter hypocrite and ask that if anyone is able to get me one for my collection, I would be deeply appreciative of it, because you never know when this material can come in handy for making videos. So if you think you can get me one of these study versions of the Bible, despite all of the disparaging things I've just said, by all means reach out to the team at JW Survey. I would love to hear from you that way. But we must now introduce our next speaker on the 2019 annual meeting, and based on the pungent whiff of single malt that I can smell even from here, we can only assume that it's Tight Pants himself, Tony Morris.
It was a great pleasure to hear all of the excitement when the Ramapo project was announced to all of you here, and I'm sure that was true for the other thousands that are tied in. And then you saw with these videos all the construction projects going on all over the earth. So it's quite interesting. You think about it now from an imperfect human perspective, frankly not thinking spiritually. You say, well, we just dedicated the Warwick property along with Wallkill recently. Now here we go. Down the road, you know? Well, the preaching work obviously is premier. And that's what this is really about, the preaching work. To support the preaching work and to continue to feed Jehovah's precious sheep the way he wants them fed, it involves all this construction. So God wants us to have it clear. We want you to spread this, and of course it'll come up in January. Keep in mind, we have work to do, period. So get over it. Don't get me going on vacation. I'll just tell you, and I know my friends on the governing body, and not that you need your time, I'm not trying to put you on a guilt trip, but we got a whole lot of days. Because how do you, with the work that's going on, how do you try to rest up when you can, and Jehovah wants us to, but we have so much work to do. And we thank God for it.
Alexa, is Anthony Morris inebriated in this video?
Dude, the guy is toasted. How is he even vertical?
Alexa, can you tell me where Anthony Morris is right now?
You don't want to know.
Alexa, seriously, where is Anthony Morris?
Halfway through a bottle of Macallan's.
All jokes aside, wow. I mean, we're talking about October 2019 when this was filmed. That's 6 months after Bottlegate, when Tony was caught on camera buying very expensive single malt, lots of it, at great expense at Bottle King. 6 months on, here he is on the annual meeting platform. As far as I'm concerned, he's slurring, he's incoherent, he's barely holding it together. Clearly, no lessons have been learned. It seems that he just got clean away with it, and you're not telling me the rest of the governing body didn't find out about that footage that I showed on the channel. It seems that once you've climbed the ladder high enough in this organisation, you become untouchable, to the point where something like Bottlegate can happen and it can just be shrugged off, even to the extent that they're putting this guy on the stage at the annual meeting. And maybe it's just me, by all means let me know what you think in the comments. Come on, the guy is clearly inebriated, and that's before we even get to the substance of what he's talking about, which, if you think about it, just smacks of utter arrogance. I mean, he's posing the question himself, how can it be that the governing body is building Ramapo and devoting so much time to the project to the point where they're saying, oh, it's not going to be up and running until 2026. What does that say about the urgency of the times we're living in? And his answer to that is, deal with it.
We have work to do, period. So get over it.
We don't have to answer to you. Who do you think you are? We're the faithful slave. We're the ones that get to dictate what the need is as we see it. And if we think we need our own private Hollywood, we're damn well going to build it. And actually, we're not going to build it. You're going to build it for us. Just get with the program. That's his whole attitude here.
My father has kept working until now, and I keep working. So the hardest worker in the universe is Jehovah. God in Christ Jesus is right there with them. Jehovah's a worker. His people have to be workers. That's what he expects, and it's such a pleasure to serve the true God and work. Romans chapter 12, and here's what Christians are all about when it comes to work for Jehovah. Verse 11, be industrious, not lazy. See, Jehovah does not approve of lazy. Be aglow with the Spirit. See, just absorbed with it. There's this zeal just alive with it as we slave for Jehovah. So he appreciates an industrious, hard-working spirit, and that's what he wants from his people.
Clearly many of you won't have understood a word this drunken, slurring buffoon just said, so let me translate it for you. We want our nice new shiny Ramapo. You're going to build it for us because it says in this Bible verse that Christians ought to be workers. So all of you guys listening, you should all be workers. You should work for us to build Ramapo. And if you don't work for us, you're lazy. That genuinely seems to be the message here. Never mind the fact that this is all one big vanity project to service the ego of buffoons like Tony Morris, apart from the clearly exploitative side of all of this. What you have here is guilt tripping. What you have here is witnesses being told, do what we tell you to do and help us in the ways that we want to be helped, or you're lazy. Maybe it's just me, viewers, but I can take lectures on laziness from almost anyone apart from this man.
with all of the announcements and the videos with construction going on, I just thought I'd share this with you. It's a very special item of mine, and comes up recently. It's, as you can see here, best you can, the camera can pick it up. And up here it says building permit. And it's a special memory for me personally, because as we had in some of the videos, when we were involved with the construction, or before construction started with the Warwick project, we'd be at Tuxedo, and a lot of work going on in preparatory, looking for that day when they could get started. So the governing body would do their best to get up and be encouraging, always wearing the high-vis outfits, and then give a spiritual talk. I think it's the only time I've given a talk in high-vis. And so this particular day was special because things were moving along with the community. They liked us, but I noticed Zeny in the one video, he mentioned shovel to the ground, and that's okay, we're different. I'm calling it shovel in the ground. Zeny's not from America, so it means the same thing, Zeny, so forgive me, you know, appreciate all your hard work.
He is recollecting his experience of giving a talk in high-vis at the Warwick site at the precise moment when the building permit was finally issued. So he's making a huge deal about the fact that the privilege fell to him to give the announcement at the Warwick site, but he's just doing it. I mean, it's not really an interesting story. If you're going to include it briefly. I mean, don't labour the point, but he labours it and drags in this Zeny guy, starts talking about Zeny, and I'm thinking, who the hell is Zeny? I don't remember who it is you're talking about.
I noticed Zeny in the one video, he mentioned shovel to the ground, and that's okay, we're different. I'm calling it shovel in the ground.
And then it occurred to me that he's referring to someone who was already shown on a previous video at this annual meeting. So let me now show you so that you can understand who it is that Tony is talking about. Let me now show you a video clip of Zeny talking about the whole idea of shovel to the ground.
For almost a year now, we've been working with pre-construction activities, and of course that means thousands and thousands of hours in project planning and project design. And of course, once that building permit is obtained and we've actually put shovel to the ground, then we would expect that we'd have 4 years or less to actually deliver the project.
So Tony just picks up on this phrase, shovel to the ground, and just fixates on it and treats it like this stand-up routine. Of course, everyone's laughing along with him. Again, why wouldn't they? Because he's a governing body member and they feel they have to laugh. But this is his major thing that he needs to talk about at the annual meeting of Jehovah's Witnesses. The fact that some guy called Zeny likes to say shovel to the ground, whereas Tony likes to say shovel in the ground.
But any that have been involved with construction, and you get a lot of folks that I know here, former regional building committee, you know, all the hard-working construction, and it's always been special to work on these spiritual projects. Well, this particular day, and there were a lot of things going on, so I'm up there, it's July 26th, and that date is up here in the corner. It's a Friday, and it's the year 2013, quite a while ago. So I have a talk to give to them at 1:30 after visiting some. 2 hours before, so it must have been around 11:30, they got the building permit. So the construction project committee, and how much we love those men and their wives, they're there, and they thought, well, would you mind making this announcement And I thought, boy, that timing worked out good. That's quite an honor. No construction, and the shovel in the ground announcement. So give him a little spiritual side. It's a little glory's all right for a human sometimes, So it was very exciting. And then, but the memory is clear, and those that were there, because the operation of Holy Spirit and the brothers being aglow with the Spirit, industrious. When they made the announcement, I'm telling you, and those that were there, the joy, the thunderous applause, and it wasn't anything to do with me, it was they got the shovel in the ground. And the excitement. So I was able to easily walk out of there, and they're all busy, thrilled over shovel in the ground approval.
A little glory, Tony.
A little glory's all right for a human sometimes, So
I think it's more than just a little glory when you are breaking apart families just because people disagree with you. I think that counts as more than just a little glory. And quite frankly, the way you speak on this stage, in your barely concealed state of inebriation, smacks of nothing but narcissism and arrogance and lapping up the attention that comes with your position, making people laugh at jokes that just aren't funny, that are all about you and your power and your authority. You talk about laziness. You talk about the need for people to work for you, to build things for you, to build a new shiny Ramapo, to promote you. And you suggest that if people don't get on board, they're lazy, while at the same time you squeeze children for their ice cream money and then go on a spending spree where you're buying the most expensive single malt. You, sir, are a hypocrite.
And some would say, well, and it's happened on occasion, not a lot of God's spiritual minded folks, but you believe the end's coming? So what are you doing all this for? If the end's really close, what are you doing? Well, the end's going to come when Jehovah's satisfied with the preaching, but it's also a reminder here in Revelation chapter 7. This is always something you can forget. After this, I saw 4 angels standing on the 4 corners of the earth, holding tight the 4 winds of the earth so that no wind could blow on the earth or on the sea or on any tree. Then I saw another angel ascending from the sunrise, having a seal of the living God, and he called with a loud voice to the 4 angels to whom was granted to harm the earth and the sea, saying, and it's loud, do not harm the earth or the sea or the trees until after we have sealed the slaves of our God in their foreheads. Oh. Now, some individual anointed, they had to have a final seal before they die, and we've had a number of them die during the last days. But this is talking about right before Jehovah starts, or has it in the hearts of the governments to destroy Babylon, that all of those that are left down here at the remnant, genuine anointed disciples of Christ, they get the final seal. And this is what's going to take place. And then after that, the Great Tribulation breaks out. And you keep an eye on the news to some degree, if you can stomach it, to at least know what's happening. The end is definitely close. There's just no denying it. We eagerly look forward to taking place. The Great Tribulation, it's close. However, as we eagerly await, we want to have Jehovah's mind on the matter and wait patiently.
I hope you noticed the obvious attempt at gaslighting there. So Tony Morris raises the question, well, what about those who say, why are you building if the end is so close? And he says, well, hopefully no spiritual-minded people would be asking this.
You know, some would say, well, and it's happened on occasion, not a lot of God's spiritual-minded folks, but...
In other words, you wouldn't ask this question. It wouldn't even occur to you if you were what Tony considers spiritually minded. In other words, how dare you ask that question? You're not spiritual, are you, if you're going to ask that question? If you were spiritual, you would just swallow everything hook, line and sinker and go along with whatever we say. It's not spiritual to question our judgments, to question our decisions, to question our authority. You need to be a spiritually minded person, brother. You need to just rein in that ego there and stop thinking so highly of yourself. This is gaslighting. All narcissists do it. They try to make you think that the problem is with you. And for the most part, it works wonderfully. But I, for one, am calling it out, and I can see straight through it, and I'm sure many of you watching this can see it clearly as well. You cannot say, on the one hand, Armageddon's coming any moment. It's just so close. I mean, you can almost smell it. And on the other hand, say, by the way, we're building a shiny new Hollywood just a couple of miles down the road. It's going to be finished by 2026. The two positions are clearly unreconcilable. And Tony's solution is to quote verses from Revelation about the remnant. And maybe it's just me. By all means, comment below. I couldn't make head nor tail of what his reasoning was there. He just kind of babbled in this semi-drunken, incoherent rambling, and then immediately just leaped straight from his train of thought to, oh, well, the end's close. Just trust us, the end is close, but also we're building... Anyway, the end's close.
The end is definitely close. There's just no denying it.
It makes no sense. And why would it make sense if, number one, the guy is toasted, and number two, the guy is completely deluded?
And I think with all of those here, because here at least at Newburgh, so many years in the truth, especially corporate members and their mates if they're married, this Watchtower we want to share with you from 1976, profound statements, just to this day they ring true about this matter of the end. And it shows you where we are in the stream of time, and Jehovah's Spirit was on him, not inspired, but he captured it with them, helping them, and it was just ringing, and it still rings to this day. Now notice what that 76 November 15th Watchtower said, pages 688, 689. And in the 17th paragraph, notice, quoting it, "The end does not come just because we might think it is the due date, or because we feel that our territory has been well worked. It comes when Jehovah has carried through the great work of kingdom preaching to the extent he wants. And then he will bring the great tribulation." Now listen, back 1976. "Until that time, there is work to do. And we as Jehovah's Witnesses are the ones assigned to do it. The arrival of the Great Tribulation should find the preaching work at the height of its forward movement, at the very peak of its momentum throughout the earth. The arrival of the Lord Jesus to execute judgment will come as a complete surprise even to Jehovah's people, for it will no doubt find them at their busiest time of activity." Think about it. You've been busier since you've been in the truth than recently? So we're the busiest we've been, hands down. See? So it's amazing how the slave captured that right attitude in 1976. And of course, some in the truth there, at least certain parts of the earth, they're thinking the end's coming in 75. And look at all the growth since the 70s. You had about 2 million back in the 70s that were witnesses of the true God. Now we're approaching 9 million.
So I have to cut in here. Tony, what are you talking about? You are quoting from a 1976 Watchtower saying, the end is here. We need to be so busy because the end is here. 1976? I'm 40 and that's before I was born. And this is your go-to source to show us how urgent the times are now. All you're doing is proving that this organisation has a track record, has a history of keeping people on tenterhooks thinking the end is imminent when it isn't. That's what the entire history of the organisation has been about. The end's just around the corner. The end's in 1914. The end's in 1925. Oh, our bad. The end's in 1975. Oh, it's not come. Never mind. We'll blame it on the people and we'll suggest, as Tony is doing here, that this was just a few witnesses in, how does he put it, in some parts of the earth.
And of course, some in the truth there, at least certain parts of the earth, they're thinking the end's coming in 75.
There were these pockets of witnesses, apparently, under the bizarre impression that Armageddon was coming in 1975. Maybe it had something to do, Tony, with this book. Maybe it had something to do with that. Maybe the fact that 1975 was specifically pointed to as a year of significance. Maybe, I don't know, maybe that had something to do with it. But oh no, it's their fault. Honestly, the gall of this man, and the passages he's reading as well, about keeping busy in the preaching work. Why is Ramapo needed to do the preaching work? Is there not already a preaching work? Are there not already highly produced videos being created by the organisation at a rate of hundreds per year? So clearly there is nothing holding the organisation back from making these videos. We've heard the reason already in this very annual meeting that the purpose for Ramapo is convenience. Is because it's inconvenient for witnesses to have to commute to different locations. It would be so much easier if everything was in one location.
The teaching committee was discussing all that is being asked of audio-video services, all the videos that they're producing, and we could see that it was a little bit difficult because this department was spread out over 4 different complexes, 10 different buildings, and 16 different floors. So working together and collaborating has been a little difficult being spread out.
Well, how does that play with what you were just saying about work and about being willing to do work? If you're a Bethelite at one of these locations and your work involves commuting a little bit, shouldn't you be grateful that you're doing that work? It seems that the only ones who are expected to do work are the rank and file witnesses.
Verse 11, be industrious, not lazy. See, Jehovah does not approve of lazy.
Whereas it's a different rule for Tony, and it's a different rule for Bethelites when it comes to the need for convenience.
So in conclusion, there's closing thoughts, and this is priceless from that same Watchtower. Jehovah's advancing theocratic society will be a going concern, a go-forward organization, right down to and through the Great Tribulation. So, like I've told brothers for a long time, the recent changes from RBC to where, this is all New World construction going on here. You're taking this over after Armageddon. You're going to just keep on working, and others will be trained. And then the worship of God, the Watchtower said, is with spirit and truth, is positive, enthusiastic, spirited, and progressive. And then this is profound. More and more sections of the earth and western lands, in the Orient and elsewhere, are now receiving a thorough witness. And who knows how much farther the glorious good news will be sounded before the end. Well, God knows. And look at the sound of the good news being all over the earth, most distant parts of the earth. So may all of us beg Jehovah to continue to empower us to keep worshiping him with spirit and truth, enthusiasm and zeal, because we have work to do.
Well, I don't know about truth, Tony, but you certainly have no problem, as far as I can tell, when it comes to worshipping Jehovah with spirits. Seriously though, what a load of manipulative nonsense. This guy is trying to persuade witnesses that it's not just for the here and now that they're building, that they are increasing Watchtower's real estate portfolio. Oh, all of this is for the new world. Obviously, how could you not see that these are all buildings and kingdom halls and Bethel facilities that will be in use after the Great Tribulation? We're just going to go straight on through with these lovely buildings in the new world. It's not purely about Watchtower assets. It's not purely about flipping real estate. No, we're going to be cuddling pandas right outside these buildings. We're going to be tucking into watermelons on picnic tables with these fabulous buildings as a backdrop. Oh, come on. Nobody surely is that stupid. We can see what all of this is about. We can see already Watchtower profiting from its property, from its real estate. They did it in Puerto Rico. They've unveiled a master plan of freeing up millions by merging congregations and selling the surplus of kingdom halls. We can see that this is the strategy. Use volunteer labour to increase Watchtower assets and give Watchtower more that it can sell to bring in extra cash to make up for the fact that growth is stagnant. That's what all of this is about. Maybe not Ramapo. Ramapo is a little bit different. Ramapo is about increasing Watchtower's ability to manipulate people. But on the whole, when it comes to property, when it comes to construction, when it comes to build, this is all about filling Watchtower's coffers, and you would have to be incredibly naive to think otherwise. But mercifully, Tony's part is now over. We can look forward to the next speaker, and surely Mark Sanderson, who is obviously younger and hopefully less inebriated, will bring a little bit of common sense to proceedings and steer us away from this alarmist doomsday rhetoric.
We are in a war, and we expect to be hated by all the nations. And we expect that people will say every sort of wicked thing against us.
Okay. Yes, nothing to see here, folks. It's just witnesses being told that they are at war with everyone else. Everyone else apparently is itching to find nasty things, evil things, wicked things to say about Jehovah's people. It couldn't possibly be the case that this is a human organisation that makes mistakes, some of which cause tremendous pain and heartache in people's lives. No, we all know that this is God's one true organisation and cannot put a foot wrong. So if ever anyone is saying anything unpleasant about Jehovah's Witnesses, they are automatically liars.
Well-known statesman Franklin Roosevelt said, "The only thing that we have to fear is fear itself." Well, he's not completely correct, but there's certainly a note of truth in what he said. You see, fear is a powerful weapon in the hand of our great adversary, Satan the devil. He will use that weapon against us. And what is the danger? You see, brothers, when we are afraid or we are terrified, we can then be controlled by our enemies. You see, people who are in fear of death are constantly afraid. And as a result, they can be manipulated and controlled. Now, take, for example, the Nuremberg trials that occurred at the end of the Second World War. Various Nazis who had committed horrible, terrible atrocities were brought to justice. And when these individuals, both men and women, were asked the simple question, how could you do these terrible things? What did they say? We had no choice. If we didn't obey, they would put us to death. Those people could be manipulated, they could be controlled, they could even get them to do the most wicked things because they were afraid.
If there's an irony overload in any part of the entire annual meeting, surely it is this. Mark Sanderson is spelling out Watchtower's playbook. He's just putting it right there on the table. He's saying, if you're afraid, if you're terrified, if you are plagued with existential dread, you can be controlled. You can be manipulated. Of course, we would never do this. It's only the bad guys. It's only people like Hitler who would do this. We're just warning you that that's what they're up to. The hypocrisy is astounding.
Fear is interesting. That is, in principle, fear can be inside a person, and if someone is afraid, that is not shameful. But the question is, can you overcome this fear? Can you get the fear under your control? Can you overcome the surge of negativity? And when my heart persuaded me to get scared, then I started to pray. I prayed to Jehovah to give me courage and not be afraid of anyone or anything. I still say to myself, Felix, do not fear anybody or anything except Jehovah.
Dear brothers and sisters, I really appreciate your support. I'm very happy for all your letters, for all your thoughts, for all your prayers. I really appreciate it a lot. I try to do my best, and I try to serve Jehovah in the best way that I could. I will do that forever.
Brothers and sisters, we know that persecution is coming to us too. May we trust in Jehovah and overcome any fear that we have of our opposers. May we be confident that any lions on our path are chained. Look at the chains, not the lions. And may we be ever guided by our wholesome fear of Jehovah God. Are you determined to fear nothing except our wonderful God, Jehovah? Then I ask you, what do we have to fear?
Are you determined to fear nothing but imminent annihilation at Armageddon if you put a foot wrong and don't do as we tell you? And they're all there clapping like seals. None of them can see the irony here. And of course, the whole talk really was building up to this video that I showed you a brief part of. You have witnesses in Russia talking about the Russian authorities clamping down on the religion. I've obviously spoken at length about the ban in Russia. I think it's a very bad idea. What the Russian authorities are doing, unfortunately, is fueling Watchtower's narrative. Watchtower laps up this kind of attention. They have a very strong persecution complex. They use oppression by governments and turn it round and use it to further manipulate their followers. So here they are very clearly pointing to what's going on in Russia, showing Dennis Christensen, for example, in his, I don't know whether it's a cell or some kind of cubicle. He's being restrained, he's being incarcerated, his freedom has been taken from him, and they're pointing to individuals like Dennis Christensen and saying, this is very likely going to happen to you too, but this is what we should expect. This is what Satan's world is going to do to Jehovah's people in the time of the end. Really, all this is doing is proving that we're right. Because if we were wrong and if we weren't Jehovah's people, then no one would be persecuting us. So it feeds in directly to the narrative that Watchtower has been pushing for decades, that Satan's world is out to get them. And that alone, if you think about it, is an extra layer of fear-mongering. Watchtower uses literal fear of death in terms of Armageddon. You're terrified that when Armageddon comes, if you're not loyal, you're going to be among those who are slain. You're going to be among those who don't get to make it through to the paradise earth. But there's this extra layer of fear-mongering whereby Mark Sanderson is saying, well, the authorities are obviously going to come for us at some point. You should be afraid of the authorities. But ultimately, Jehovah is going to save us. Jehovah is going to ride to the rescue, because we're being persecuted purely because we are worshipping Jehovah. So it's another layer of fear-mongering on top of the existential dread that Jehovah's Witnesses already have.
Now we are looking forward to the discussion by Brother Jackson on the interesting theme, are you completely sober? I guess so, looking at the time.
Are you completely sober? I know what you're thinking. Really? Seriously? The answer is obvious, isn't it? We've been in this assembly hall for hours and there's no opportunity to drink. So the answer to the question seems rather obvious, doesn't it?
Actually, this is kind of awkward, but I wouldn't be so sure of that, Jeff. Alexa, play evidence that at least one person at the annual meeting has indeed been drinking.
Don't get me going on vacation. I'll just tell you, and I know my friends on the governing body, be aglow with the Spirit. So you're just absorbed with it. There's this zeal just alive with it as we slave. You know, a lot of work going on in preparatory, looking for that day. It means the same thing, Zeny, so forgive me, you know. But any that have been involved with construction, and you get a lot of folks that I know here, former regional building committee, you know, all the hard-working construction. So give them a little spiritual side. You know, it's a, you know, little glory's all right for a human sometimes, you know. You believe the end's coming? The end's going to come when Jehovah's satisfied with the preaching, but it's also a reminder here, genuine anointed disciples of Christ, they get the final seal. Spirit and truth, enthusiasm and zeal, because
We have work to do.
So yes, it seems Geoff Jackson is in a bit of denial there when it comes to his governing body comrade. But no, Geoff Jackson is here giving a talk all about sobriety, being sober. And it's a bit difficult to understand why he chose this theme, assuming he chose it, of course. The whole talk seems at least partly intended to impress Jehovah's Witnesses regarding Watchtower's Bible translation efforts and the way they have rendered certain verses, as we're going to see. But there's also a very clear, distinct message that Jehovah's Witnesses are to be sober, not so much in a literal sense, so Tony's off the hook there, more in a symbolic sense. So they should take their religion, their faith very seriously, and this symbolic sobriety also involves, as we're going to see, making sure that witnesses don't pay any attention to opposers and false stories about Jehovah's Witnesses in the media.
The Greek expression here could be translated as being sober perfectly. But notice we have the expression translated as keep your senses completely. So that raises an interesting question. Why didn't the New World Translation Bible Committee say to be sober or to be completely sober? Well, the answer to that question goes back to your initial reaction when you heard the title of this talk. Let's be honest. When you heard, "Are you completely sober?" what did you think of immediately? Drinking alcohol or avoiding it. But the majority of times that this expression occurs in the Christian Greek scriptures, it does not specifically refer to avoiding alcohol or becoming intoxicated with alcohol. Rather, it has a larger figurative meaning. So for us to follow the admonition to be sober, we need to know really what the Bible means by that expression. What is included in that?
So yes, it continues to be quite a cringeworthy talk in light of Bottlegate, but I hope you've noticed what's happening here. Geoff Jackson is essentially making excuses for the fact that the translators of, I say translators, the ones who put together the New World Translation took some liberties with the word sober. And I think that in the context of a document that is setting forth, you could say, religious rules, it's perfectly conceivable that the writers did indeed literally mean stay sober or be sober in certain situations. And that's going to become even more obvious in some of the next examples that we're going to hear. But just interesting to see the kind of excuses that the governing body are willing to make when it suits them. Because there is a little bit of history here when it comes to alcoholism in the organisation. I touched on this in my video about Rutherford. Rutherford was almost certainly, alcoholics may be a strong word, but certainly given to drinking lots of alcohol would be fair. It was just an open secret that he enjoyed drinking, to the extent where he even released a booklet complaining about prohibition. Remember, he was supposed to be one of the faithful slave at this point. So the faithful slave was complaining to the US government about prohibition. Seems like an extreme step to produce spiritual food on that subject, unless you happen to be fond of booze, as Rutherford was. So there's form here. There is actually a track record of Watchtower leaders enjoying alcohol. So it makes total sense that when they are producing their own version of the Bible and they're encountering passages that talk about a need for sobriety, they're like, oh, maybe we'll just tweak this to mean something a bit more vague and a bit more general. So it's not talking about being sober, it's talking about being alert and keeping your senses. It sounds to me as though Geoffrey Jackson in this talk is making excuses for generations of Watchtower leaders going right up to 2013 when the revised New World Translation came out. Generations of Watchtower leaders effectively doctoring the Bible to suit them. They enjoy alcohol. Clearly they don't want to be reading verses that talk about being sober, so they make those verses say something else. And again, look out for more examples of this as Geoffrey Jackson's talk progresses.
So what we're going to briefly do is look at 4 different ways that the New World Translation has covered this verse, this expression. And by looking at the different ways in English that this has been translated, we'll see what really is involved with this expression, to be sober. So let's start. If you turn with me, please, to 1 Timothy chapter 3. And immediately we remember that 1 Timothy chapter 3 is talking about the qualifications for overseers, and also it mentions what sisters should do. Now in verse 2 and verse 11, we won't read it, but glancing at it, in Greek, the word to be sober literally is there, and you can see it in the Kingdom Interlinear. But how is it translated? We don't see the word sober, do we? The expression there is to be moderate in habits. Now, why did the brothers translate it this way? Because although it could refer to avoiding being intoxicated, it has this wider meaning of having good sense when it comes to things like conduct and speech, or the choice of entertainment or recreation.
Again, I'm no Bible scholar, but what I'm seeing here is Watchtower doctoring the Bible to suit them. And I haven't done extensive research on these verses that he's showing. I did briefly look up this one in Timothy. And what's interesting is that other Bible translations do use sober. I think the King James Version says sober, whereas other translations, including the New World Translation, dress up the language a little bit and pad it out so that rather than saying sober, in this case it's moderate in habits. It seems perfectly obvious what's going on here. The people who are translating the Bible don't want to read these texts when they go to church on a Sunday, or don't want to read these texts when they come up in the Watchtower. They don't want to be confronted with reminders of the need for being literally sober. They want to ease their conscience a little bit, so they're softening the language. At least that's what it looks like to me. When you're talking about criteria for a Christian minister, which is what's being mentioned here in Timothy, here are all the criteria that we expect of someone who's going to be an overseer in the congregation. Sober. It seems very likely that they mean literally sober. Why would you want drunken elders in your congregation? It seems obvious that they would include that as a requirement. But again, Watchtower comes along with its long history of leaders who have given in to alcohol and says, this means moderate in habits. It doesn't mean literally being sober. If you believe that the Bible is the Word of God, then what this amounts to is putting words in God's mouth. Either this is God's Word or it isn't. If it's really God's Word, and if it really uses the word sober in Greek, and the context makes total sense, what's your justification for changing it?
Well, there are so many opportunities today for education, recreation, entertainment, travel, vacations, employment, and business. Are we truly sober when it comes to those things? Or are we like the person who's trying to grab every opportunity and use the world to the full?
Of course, only Watchtower gets to grab every opportunity and use the world to the full. Only Watchtower gets to dabble in investment funds, which is something I touched on in a recent video. Only Watchtower gets to amass a property portfolio and put up websites posing as real estate agents to sell on property that is surplus to their requirements. It's one rule for Watchtower, it's another rule for the rank and file. Inevitably, a simple concept, a simple principle of sobriety is being blown completely out of proportion and in a hypocritical way when you think of the lack of control, the lack of self-control when it comes to literal sobriety on the governing body itself. Rather than addressing that more urgent problem, they are taking this opportunity 6 months after Bottlegate to lecture Jehovah's Witnesses on the need to rein in the desire for higher education, rein in the desire to succeed in the business world, and just stay compliant and subservient to the governing body.
So could it be that we may be affected by the opinions of some, maybe even within the congregation, who say, is the end really so close? Or is what the world offers really that bad? Or if we were to be tempted to believe every account or report on the internet with regard to those taking the lead in the organization, do we just quickly believe those things? Or worse still, do we search the internet looking for juicy stories about other Jehovah's Witnesses? We need to remember Satan is the father of the lie. He's an expert at lying. And he makes sure there are plenty of lies for us to come across. But if we are sober spiritually, this means we won't get fooled or tricked by false stories.
They have literally taken a talk on sobriety and flipped it to the extent where being sober now involves not listening to any criticism of the organisation. That's literally what he's just said. Don't trust anything out there that's negative. Don't go searching for anything negative. There can be nothing negative that's also truthful. Because we're God's organisation. Everything that we're doing is just, is kind, is pure, is loving. So nothing that's negative can be truthful by default. Whatever you do, don't go looking for information on, for example, the Australian Royal Commission. Don't go looking for information on Geoffrey Jackson's testimony and what he had to say, his own words coming out of his own mouth, in which he completely misrepresented Jehovah's Witness practices and beliefs. This is the information that's waiting there for witnesses who can summon the courage and the intellectual honesty to find out once and for all, is this really the truth? And instead of encouraging that kind of inquisitive, genuine spirit of affirmation, of discovery, of wanting to have something that's pure and true as your guiding compass, instead witnesses are being terrified into thinking that in addition to losing their life at Armageddon, if they listen to what opposers have to say, they're also just lacking in self-control generally. They are failing to be sober if they try to get to the bottom of whether they're being lied to or not.
Think of this illustration. There could be a guard, and that guard is totally awake, but he's watching the tournament on the television. Maybe it's the football, something he's excited with. He's not alert to the dangers that are lurking. So in a similar way, we need to be totally awake spiritually and alert to what is happening, to the dangers that present themselves, such as getting involved with the political issues that we see in the world today. To do so would make us part of the world. Yes, we have to focus on God's kingdom as the only true solution. That's what it means to be sober.
At this point, it's just layers upon layers of hypocrisy. We've already had Mark Sanderson laying out on the table the fact that people who try and make you fearful are also likely trying to control you. Now Geoffrey Jackson is saying, well, of course we wouldn't want to get involved politically with what's going on around us in Satan's system of things, because that would be taking our eye off the ball. That would be losing our sense of alertness. Well, what did Watchtower do with the United Nations from 1992 to 2001? Let's do a bit of digging there, shall we? Or would that make us lose our spiritual sobriety if we were to do some digging and find out that for 9 years at least, Watchtower was an NGO member of the United Nations Department for Public Information? How is that not getting involved politically? Again, it's one rule for Watchtower and another rule for everyone else.
This year is a special year. It marks 100 years since the appointment of the faithful and discreet slave. That slave, when we look back over the 100 years, has remained awake spiritually speaking and alert and keeping on reminding us of the need to do that. Now, it's true, some might say, well, yes, but at times, when we look back over the 100 years, there were times they got excited about a certain year or time, and the end didn't come at that time. But just imagine if you had a watchdog, and that dog barks in the middle of the night, and you get up and there's nothing there. Do you shoot the dog? It only proves that the dog is doing what you want it to do. So in a similar way, realize the faithful slave. Yes, in the enthusiasm, sometimes we have said things that maybe disappointed others. But remember, the role of the faithful and discreet slave is to feed us, to keep us awake spiritually and keep us alert. And thinking about it, when that day comes, when Jesus brings destruction on this wicked system of things, where do you want to be? On a beach drinking a martini? Climbing a symbolic tree to get the last bit of fruit from this world? Or do you want to be busy in Jehovah's service, whether it's building and preaching and all the things we need to do? We know the answer. Yes, but to do that, we have to remain sober spiritually.
Being sober spiritually apparently means letting the faithful slave off the hook whenever they get it wrong. And Geoffrey Jackson has just admitted before an entire annual meeting audience, and indeed every Jehovah's Witness who watches this, he's admitted that they have repeatedly throughout their history made wrong predictions. They've said the end's coming in 1925, it hasn't come. They've said the end's coming in 1975, it hasn't come. They've said the end is coming before the generation that witnessed the events of 1914 dies off. That didn't happen. Prediction after prediction after prediction hasn't come true, but don't worry, Geoffrey Jackson's got it all figured out, because apparently the faithful slave over 100 years has just been an overexcited dog. And you wouldn't want to shoot a dog that wakes you up in the middle of the night. What a manipulative illustration. Because I don't see the faithful slave as a dog. A dog is man's best friend. A dog does much more than simply keep an eye out for intruders. A dog is part of the family. A dog is something that enriches your life. That cannot be said of the faithful slave. The faithful slave is not a pet It's a parasite. And if you have a mosquito on your arm, you swat it. If you have a leech on your leg, you take it off and you throw it away. And people who throw away the faithful slave because they are tired of their lies, they are tired of their abuse, and they are tired of their manipulation, are fully justified in doing so.
Yes, the faithful slave has been serving us with spiritual food for 100 years. But friends, remember, the faithful slave will not always be here. Soon will come the time when the remaining ones of the anointed will be taken to have their reward. Of course, Jehovah will continue to care for us. He always has a provision in place to care for us. But what is the important thing? What is it that the faithful slave wants to convey to us? Just the same as Paul and Peter wanted to convey to those to whom they wrote. We want to convey to you the importance of each one of us being moderate in habits, vigilant with regard to prayers, keeping our senses, not being distracted by false stories, and being alert to the time in which we're living. So we leave you with that question. Are you sober? Are you completely sober?
I don't think that was a talk about being sober. I think that was a talk about being compliant. I think that was a talk about not being interested as to whether you're actually in the truth or not. Just go along with what we're telling you. It doesn't matter if we make mistakes. It doesn't matter if we get it wrong. At least we are being enthusiastic. It's the enthusiasm that counts, brothers and sisters. It's the fact that we are at least producing something by way of spiritual food. Doesn't matter whether it's true or not, at least it's spiritual food. At least it's going to sustain you, even if it's a load of nonsense. This has not been a talk about being moderate in any meaningful or productive way. This has been a talk telling Jehovah's Witnesses to keep their heads in the sand. Don't notice the man behind the curtain. Just swallow everything we have to tell you, hook, line, and sinker.
We care for the things that are important to us, don't we? And there are many of such things. For example, we care for our families. We care for our friends. We care for our ministry. And above all, we care for our worship of Jehovah.
We care about our family. We care about our friends. We care about our ministry. But above all, we care about our worship of Jehovah. Just let those words sink in. If you're watching this rebuttal as someone who's just interested in learning more about Jehovah's Witnesses, there you have it in a nutshell. Family comes second to the religion.
How can we help our Bible students so that even more of them become baptized disciples as Jesus there directed? This is important to consider because while many get baptized each year, our yearly baptism figures have remained at about the same level for some time. Now, are these good figures? Yes, they are. Absolutely. But what can we do to help even more people take this vital step before the end comes? We do it through what we emphasize about Jehovah, what we teach our students about prayer, how we help them get to meetings, and how we help them handle problems.
So I probably should have introduced him earlier. This is Kenneth Cook, who is the most recent addition to the governing body. I really don't have that much material to show you of his talk because mostly it was an incredibly dreary talk, as if I'm going to be completely honest, most of his talks are. Sorry, Kenneth, I don't find your stuff all that interesting, but I did find it interesting when he was talking about the baptism figures and how these stay mostly the same year after year. And he seems to think that by pushing a bit harder, by following the advice of the organization, somehow witnesses can find another gear and the baptism figures can shoot up just before Armageddon, so as many people can get saved as possible. Again, going back to David Splain's prediction at the beginning of this video, I don't think that's an entirely realistic expectation. I think if anything, the organization should be bracing itself for these baptism figures to start to dip eventually, as more people, even in developing countries where presently there isn't quite as much access to the internet, that's not going to stay the same forever. At some point, almost everyone on the planet is going to surely have the same access to online resources that completely debunk Jehovah's Witness teachings and show it for the abusive organization that it is.
So then, with all of this in mind, what is our year text for 2020? It is taken from Matthew 28:19. Go therefore and make disciples, baptizing them. Now, for those of you who listened to Alexa earlier in the program or read your daily text for today, you know that this is also the scripture text for today, October 5th, 2019. That's just a coincidence. Don't expect it next year. Now, with that text in mind, keep putting your heart into your ministry and into helping people. And be certain to take care of this ministry with those principles we considered to the very end.
And that's it. That's the end of the annual meeting. We've been treated to a final bit of governing body stand-up, which apparently was absolutely hysterical, at least to some in the audience. That didn't sound too much like canned laughter. Some of Kenneth Cook's audience were really digging his humour there. But you have there the release of the year text for 2020. And yeah, that brings us to the end of the annual meeting. And what an interesting annual meeting it has been. For me, again, one of the most fascinating parts, apart from the very clear evidence that this is now a construction-obsessed organisation that is completely fixated with building stuff, I was also fascinated to see David Splain give almost a case study in how man-made this organisation is and how easy it is for the faithful slave to miss something blindingly obvious that completely contradicts an understanding that they've published in their spiritual food. And concerning spiritual food, we've also had, of course, Geoffrey Jackson there suggesting that to turn your back on the faithful slave would be akin to shooting a guard dog. Again, I don't quite see it that way. I think that people who turn their backs on a manipulative, abusive, coercive group like Jehovah's Witnesses are fully justified in doing so. But those were my thoughts, ladies and gentlemen, on the 2019 annual meeting of Jehovah's Witnesses. Usually these annual meetings happen October of each year, so we have a bit to go until the 2020 annual meeting, and I won't be able to do my rebuttal until the January or February of 2021 because it takes a while for Watchtower to release all the videos. But I hope you have found my thoughts on at least the 2019 annual meeting interesting. Don't forget to subscribe to the John Cedars channel for more such videos, and as always, thank you for watching.